Sorry there, got a little ahead of myself and started recording before I actually had the screen up on the slide or the screen. So here we are. Jacob manipulating Esau from Genesis 25. So titling this lesson here, Another Adam Seizing Yahweh's Blessing in a Sinful Manner. So I hope you can see here, this is progressing down in this direction in both planes. So I'm not going to go through every one of these. I think you'll get the idea after the first few examples to then get down to the actual story itself. So in the garden in Genesis 3, we have Adam seizing independent kingship without fully submitting to Yahweh. We know the backdrop of the story is that in Genesis 1, God has granted him the right to rule and subdue. And so that, of course, coordinates him as king. And then with that, he is also supposed to be acting as a priest, as goes the lens of Genesis 2, leading into Genesis 3. And with that, he's got the moment now to execute the wisdom that God has given so far, but he fails to do so. And instead of executing judgment upon this being referred to as the serpent, who is actively rebelling against God and trying to coerce the man and woman and twisting God's words to do the very same thing, instead of judging in light of what he knows from what God has said and what will happen if he disobeys, he chooses to define right and wrong for himself. And in doing so, it's like trying to grab the kingship away from God and saying, I will be king without you ruling over me, king on my own right, without the need for your help or anything that you might offer. Thank you very much. And with that, clearly, Adam is cast from the garden. Then in the very next story, we have the same thing happening. Cain has the option here, even though he's not going to be able to go back into the garden. Yet still, he could rule as king and he could serve as priest in a rather limited way in comparison to what his father had before him, if he would simply offer correctly with the right offering and the right heart attitude. And instead, he chooses to murder his brother, because that would be the way to receive the blessing. Abel is accepted, and by virtue of that, receives Yahweh's blessing. But if Abel is the only other one that lives, and yet Cain kills him, there's no other choice. It's forcing Yahweh's hand, in a sense, to try to pass the blessing on to Cain, and Yahweh will have nothing of it. So Cain is cursed, and he becomes a vagabond to go even further east. And then I just want to explain this third one here, because as you see it, you might think, well, I'm not really sure how that fits into this, but most commentators seem to think that what's going on is not just the simple fact that Ham noticed that his father was passed out drunk and was also naked, and this was something of a taboo thing for a son to look upon his unclothed father. That this concept here, as it's further defined later on in Torah, and remember, there are strong connections between stuff going on later in Torah and defined there, i.e. clean animals that Noah offered when he got off the ark. How did Noah know they were clean versus what is defined later on and whatnot? So later on in the same book that defines clean animals, i.e. Leviticus, it is said why a person is not to have sex with his father's wife or his stepsister or even his half-sister and any of this stuff, because it uncovers his father's nakedness. It's a term that is not only meant to suggest literally seeing nakedness, more so it's not really got anything to do with that. It has everything to do with seeing an extension of his father's nakedness, i.e. fruit of his loins, children, or someone married to him and has shared his bed with him. So there's always sexual connotation in that. And so with that, the idea would be that perhaps if it's Noah's nakedness and that's connected to his wife, that Ham may have even raped his own mother to conceive a child, which is borne out in the curse that comes from this, because Ham is not cursed, but rather his son Canaan, who at this point isn't even alive, as far as we can tell. And rather than being allowed to be fruitful and multiply here in the process, as goes Ham adding to the human population post-flood, rather his line after him is cursed because of what he did. Again, defining right and wrong in his own eyes, and for whatever reason acting out against his father this way. So I could go on with the other examples, but instead I want to just focus here on Jacob, because Jacob's doing the same thing. When you look at the story itself, what you have here is, like with Sarah, so with Rebekah, a struggle to conceive children, and yet God is proving himself faithful as being the one who brings about the conception of these children in his own timing by his own hand, because an appeal had to be made to Yahweh before these children could be conceived. And then when they contest with each other inside Rebekah's womb, yet again, she has to ask why, and yet God reveals the answer. Two nations are represented by these two children in her womb, and one will serve the other the older serving the younger, which is a little bit of a paradoxical thing in their day. It goes a paradigm that the older always lords it over the younger. So that blessing is already spoken here, and it's Jacob's by right because of God's sovereign election, having nothing to do with Jacob as a person, period. But later on, when the time comes, when Isaac thinks he's close to death and he wants to bless his oldest son Esau, Isaac seemingly knows this blessing, and yet he doesn't want to give it to Jacob. There's a whole conversation in that we just really aren't privy to, and we don't know why. But Jacob, even before that moment, has already sought to try to usurp God's plan here by virtue of him taking this blessing himself, trying to manipulate Esau and taking his birthright. When his brother comes in from the field, he's famished. He wants a bowl of the stew that Jacob's made, and Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright," right? And he says, "What good is it to me if I'm dead? Here, it's yours." And he blithely gives it away. Now, granted, there's a conversation to be had there about the fact that Esau acted ignobly and just despising his own birthright in the process. But that being said, Jacob had no right to do this to Esau and take it. He should have simply, as David will do later on, when his own men try to convince him, raise his hand against God's anointed king Saul, because God has anointed you to be king in his stead. And yet David says, in God's time, I will not raise my hand against the king, God's anointed, until God takes him out from the equation himself. And so Jacob could have done so and waited for God to reveal it in his own time, but he doesn't. And by virtue of that, it causes great dissension. And then Jacob has to leave for more than 20 years, imposing himself into exile because of his brother's wrath that was unnecessary had he just simply trusted and waited. So the takeaway here is yet again, a descending pattern into chaos of people who are intended for blessing and yet choose to go with their own way, which is going to be repeated amply so in Israel's future from these stories and their point of view and time and history. And of course, it shows us that we have no right to do this. And if we do this ourselves, we're going to repeat the very same mistake. Now, of course, what is the blessing that we have that we should not be trying to seize? And, well, that could be several things with respect to if God has seemingly called us into ministry or to do something else, and yet we try to go about it, accomplishing it in a way that God has not intended. And he's showing us through the resistance that comes, perhaps. Now, not all forms of resistance are necessarily God's way of telling us he doesn't have this in store for us, but you get the point. And this is why it's necessary for us to exercise discernment and wisdom and go to God's word and bond with him, commune with him in prayer, look to the wisdom and counsel that can come from other brothers and sisters on various things, and so many other points of application that could come from this. But I just hope that in pointing some of this out, it's been helpful. So thank you for your time. See you in the next session.